Hi guys, welcome to the next video in our regional circulations lesson. We're going to start off this video by talking about the skin. Now, the skin, the oxygen uptake per 100 grams, or the percentage of the total oxygen utilized in the skin is about 2%. But you'll notice that the percentage of cardiac output it gets is considerably higher than that. So skin is an overperfused tissue, and it has a fairly large blood flow relative to its metabolism. It has fewer capillaries because it's not really consuming that much oxygen, and so there isn't a whole lot of reason to have a bunch of capillaries there that are exposing those cells to a whole bunch of blood when you're not consuming that much oxygen anyway, okay? However, the reason why the skin gets so much blood isn't because of the metabolic demand. It's because of its role in temperature regulation, which I'm going to introduce to you here. And then there will be an entire lesson at some point on temperature regulation where this will be a part of it. Okay, and I just want you to know the part of regulation that pertains to the skin right now. So, when it's cold outside, all your capillaries are exposed to your skin, right? And so you lose heat through the circulation in the skin. And the more blood you send to the skin, the more heat you lose because the environment's cold. Heat radiates off. And so you, generally speaking, don't want to expose a whole lot of blood to the skin, to the surface, if it's cold outside. You want to limit that flow. So what you get is vasoconstriction. When you vasoconstrict to the capillary beds in the skin and restrict that flow, then that means there's less blood flow to the skin, less blood flow to the surface. And so you're exposing less blood to the surface of the body if you do that. So in response to cold weather, you get vasoconstriction in your skin, okay? Also note the effect of countercurrent exchange. So what countercurrent exchange is, it usually means an exchange between the arterial side and the venous side of the circulations in the body. Okay? So in this case, we have warm blood going in. We have cold blood going out. Now we've reduced the amount of blood going in because we want to expose as little as possible. But in the artery, for the blood going in, you've got blood that's relatively warm. In the vein, you have blood returning from the skin. It's relatively cold. So what happens is heat is transferred from the arterial to the venual. Okay? And you get heat transfer. We call that countercurrent exchange. Heat going this way, cold going this way, heat is transferred from high temperature to cold temperature, okay? So what happens is, because the blood is transferred here, the heat is returned to the body and never exposed to the skin. Or if it is exposed, it's exposed to for a minimal amount of time because it's returned back to the body through the venule. And so what you do is you limit the exposure of the blood, the heat. You limit the amount of heat that you can lose at the surface by heat warming, radiating from the arterial to the venule. And the venous blood becomes warmer, the arterial blood becomes colder, and so you conserve heat in the body, okay? All right. So venous return is warmed and the blood is warmed returning to the body. You conserve heat. When the body temperature is elevated, okay, then that means you're trying to get rid of heat. So if if you're overheated, you want to get rid of heat as fast as possible. You want to maximize flow to the surface so that you can get rid of that heat as much as you possibly can. So in response to that, you get vasodilation, and you get more blood flow to the skin and more exposure of blood to the surface. So you'll get rid of more heat. okay? And you also get countercurrent exchange in the opposite direction. Heat is transferred from the venule, which is probably still relatively warm, even after exposure to the surface, to the arterial, where it can be re-exposed to the skin, where you can get rid of that heat more as effectively as you can. You just try to re-expose it and re-expose it in an effort to get rid of it through countercurrent exchange the opposite way, okay? Venous return is cooler, and you keep blood relatively warm as it's exposed to the surface. Okay. Notice these AV shunts, these AV anastomoses, okay? Shunt is a really terrible term for this because it gives you the impression that its function is to shunt blood from the arterial to the venule in order to conserve something, okay? And in fact, that's not its function. Its function is to regulate resistance to flow, okay? The shunts are in the skin, all right? And when you open up a shunt, what you do is you get a dramatic decrease in the resistance to flow to the skin, okay? It's like giving a massive vasodilation, okay? So these shunts open when the body temperature is elevated, or when the body temperature is elevated. The reason why they do that is because you're reducing the resistance to flow. It's Ohm's law. And so you're increasing flow to the skin by dilating these shunts. So you have more blood that gets exposed, okay? The common way to think about this that is wrong is that you're opening these shunts in order for blood to bypass these capillaries and in order for blood to bypass the skin. That is not the case. That would suggest that you would close the shunt in this case in order to maximize flow to these capillaries and maximize exposure. That's not true. The shunts are in the skin. And what you are doing, I've had students write me emails telling me flat out that I was wrong. And the fact that your histology textbook is wrong does not help. This is a very common misconception, okay? These shunts are not there to shunt blood. They're there to change the resistance of flow in the skin. And they open up in order to decrease resistance and increase flow to the skin by allowing more blood to flow, okay? They do not constrict in order to make blood flow here. They dilate because these shunts are in the skin, and when you increase flow through these shunts, you increase the exposure of blood to the outside and to the surface, okay? So when the blood is warm, the shunts are opened, you decrease resistance and you increase flow, not the other way around. You do not close these in order to maximize flow here. You open them up in order to increase the flow everywhere because you are exposing more blood to the skin, to the surface, all right? So don't be confused by that. And of course, these shunts close when it's cold outside. They increase resistance to flow to the skin, and they help to minimize the amount of blood flow and therefore the amount of exposure to the surface in that case. All right? All right. Let's talk a little bit about the GI tract. Blood flow has to support a lot of functions: motility, absorption, okay? Blood flow increases during when you are digesting and when you need to pick up more nutrients, okay? And the reason for that is because you're increasing the activity of the smooth muscle, and then you get an increase in blood flow relative to that. So more smooth muscle activity and more metabolites, your local controls, allow increased flow. Neural controls are predominantly sympathetic, and they do play a role in the barrel reflex. So if you see a bear and you need to run away, your body knows, okay, I really don't care how much blood the GI tract is getting, and it constricts flow to the GI tract in order to shunt that blood to other areas that need oxygen, okay? The parasympathetic effects are the indirect result of stimulation of intestinal smooth muscle. So this is the dilation I was talking about up here, okay? Metabolite accumulation. There's really no parasympathetic innervation to the blood vessels themselves, okay? There is a lot of blood in the venous system in the splanchnic beds, so when you constrict to the splanchnic beds, that venous blood drains, and so it acts to actually increase circulating blood volume, that really helps in situations, particularly, let's say, during hemorrhage, where you need to increase the amount of blood. So you guys will recall I talked about the fact that a large percentage of your blood is stored in the venous system, and particularly, let's say, during hemorrhage or during a sympathetic stimulation, what you'll do is you'll make the walls of those veins more rigid, and there'll be a decrease in the compliance of the walls, so that at any given pressure you'll have less volume. So what happens is you will decrease the compliance, and that will effectively increase the circulating blood volume because there'll be less blood volume in the veins at any given pressure, okay? And then finally, note the countercurrent exchange here. There's a lot of surface area in your GI tract, and so there's a lot of opportunity to lose oxygen across that surface area from the capillaries. And so what you get is a countercurrent exchange of oxygen, where oxygen will be transferred from the arterial to the venular instead of being exposed to the intestinal tissue. I always tell this story, when you watch some of these Ironman competitions where people have been exercising for a long time, you'll see people along the roadway holding out tissues, and you'll see runners grab those tissues and wipe their legs. The reason is because their sympathetic activity has been so high for so long, they've been exercising, their sympathetic activity has been so high for so long, and they've constricted the flow to the GI tract for so high for so long that you actually start to get tissue that dies and sloughs away, and it leaks out, and you have to wipe that off of your leg. So it's pretty disgusting. And that is, of course, why I never do those Ironman competitions. That's the reason why. It's got nothing to do with the effort that it might take. So that's a pretty good example of how effective this barrel reflex response is, and how you're really restricting the oxygen to these tissues in order to prevent loss of oxygen into the GI tract and out. Okay. All right. The liver is supplied via a portal circulation. So you can see that here. You have blood. It's draining the intestines and draining into the liver through this portal system, which connects to capillary beds. Okay. What that means, because your intestines are eating up some of this oxygen, is that the amount of oxygen in this portal vein is relatively low. It's not like arterial blood. So you have a hepatic artery which goes in and supplies a little bit of oxygen and supplements oxygen to the liver, but the oxygen is still lower than you might expect, because you're mixing this arterial blood with this venous blood. And so the oxygen is still relatively low when you perfuse the liver. Not that it doesn't get enough oxygen, it does, okay? It's just something to bear in mind, the fact that you're supplementing it with this artery. Okay. The portal vein has a fairly low pressure, so the perfusion pressure here to the liver is relatively low. So the mean arterial pressure is 93 when you enter the intestines, but as you guys know, the pressure drops as you perfuse the capillaries, And when it exits the intestine, it's only about 11 or 12 millimeters of mercury. So that is the perfusion pressure for the hepatic system. Okay, and so what that means is that the capillary pressures in these sinusoids are relatively low, about 8 to 9 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and what that means is that you aren't getting a lot of filtration ordinarily in a tissue like that, right? Filtration, the amount of filtration out of a capillary that you get is proportional to the hydrostatic pressure. Well, the hydrostatic pressure in the capillaries is relatively low in the liver, okay, in the liver sinusoids. And then, of course, the vena cava is about 2 millimeters of mercury. So the capillaries in the liver are also very permeant to protein. Okay, so unlike normal capillaries where you've got a bunch of albumin that can't cross the wall, and the osmolarity is high relative to the tissues, and you're drawing water back in through reabsorption. That's not taking place so much in the liver because the capillaries in the liver are really permeant to proteins. And as you will find out, the reason for that is because you're producing proteins like albumin there. And they need to be able to get into the circulation. So what that means is that you've got relatively little filtration going on. You've got relatively little reabsorption going on because your wall is very permeant to protein and your oncotic pressure is low. So what that means is that your liver is a swamp. Okay, basically not much is moving. Okay, and the blood enters and not a lot of water leaves, not a lot of water is coming back in, and it's very, very easy to disrupt that balance. So what you find out is that when the venous pressure goes up, let's say in congestive heart failure, that makes you particularly susceptible to edema through excess filtration in your liver, and to a certain extent in your GI tract as well, because your GI tract is also very permeant to protein. Okay, so in heart failure, you get high pressure in the veins, high pressure in the portal vein, and therefore a lot of filtration here, particularly here, and in the intestinal beds. And so you get, it makes it fairly easy to accumulate fluid, and what you get is what's known as ascites, fluid accumulation in your abdominal cavity. So if we look at our patient, she's gained 10 to 15 pounds since a family visit, and it turns out during that visit she ate a bunch of salt, which did not help. Her abdomen is distended, and she's got fluid accumulation in her abdomen, and that's because she's in congestive heart failure. And that fluid is filtering across the beds in the liver, where it's extremely easy to disrupt that balance, and in the intestinal beds, where you've got a high portal pressure, and that's causing an increased filtration as well. And your intestinal beds are pretty permeant to all kinds of molecules. You need to be able to absorb nutrients there, and so that doesn't help either. Okay? All right. Thank you for your attention. And we'll move on to the next video when you're ready.